professor of history at Purdue University, but she's a connoisseur and an expert on Moroccan history. And as you already know, some of you have read the chapters. I'm not sure how many of you, but you've read a chapter of the book. And it's one of the most interesting books they've read in the last few years. No, but that's true, actually. So we'll have about half an hour, 40 minutes presentation, followed by questions and answer. And hopefully, if we have some time, we could also have questions that are not strictly related to the lecture, but you might be interested in asking things that perhaps bear on in the field of Professor Holden. So please join me in welcoming Professor Stacy Holden, and if you have any questions or anything, you can wait until the end of the presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. I have such a big booming voice that I normally do not speak with a microphone, so if you can't hear me, please let me know. I'm going to talk today a little bit about something that's quite different from what I wrote about in this book, because what I'm working on now is not Moroccan history per se, but how the history of the Arab world is viewed and manipulated by Americans, and how that has historically been so since the colonial era in the 17th century, okay? And I'm doing a project that will look at, in particular, captivity narratives over 300 years. So stories of how Americans have been taken captive, held hostage in different ways over 300 years. And I'll talk about that in the paper. But what I want to present to you today is a particular case study that I'm working on right now and thinking through, and hoping that in presenting it to you, you can help me think it through and think through the implications and importance of this particular case study, because it occurs right after Operation Torch. It occurs right after World War II. And the title of this paper is then The Cold War in Barbary, Recasting the Tripolitan War in Kenneth Roberts' Lydia Bailey. Now, Kenneth Roberts is an author of historical fiction. And in 1947, he published a work of historical fiction that was based on captivity narratives that date to the Barbary Wars in the early 19th century. He wrote a 488-page book, which I forgot to pack so that I could show you, which in retrospect is probably important because I probably saved myself like $25 because it's so heavy. It's like this big. And I would have been charged for that. But anyway, that's entre parenthèses. But he's a Pulitzer Prize winning author. He's a very important author. And in this book, he tells the tale of what is a fictional protagonist. And this man's name is Albion Hamlin. Albion is an anti-imperialist. He has a very kind of storied life. He is going to first help Haiti to become free from the French. And this is going to be in 1801. He is then going to travel to Sète with his wife, for whom the book is named, Lydia Bailey. And at that point, he is going to be captured and taken captive in Tripoli, which was then fighting the Tripolitan War against the United States, which, as you know, took place between 1801 and 1805. Albion is then going to have to free himself and his wife from captivity. Albion is not content just to free himself and his wife. He needs to also free Tripoli, right? He's already saved Haiti. You can already see sort of American ambitions coming out to play in this novel. He wants to free and save Tripoli, which is then, of course, in a polity or a province in the Ottoman Empire. So he's going to join the ill-fated venture of William Eaton, who is a actual historical character or personality. Just out of curiosity, has people heard of William Eaton in this? That's right. William Eaton was told by Thomas Jefferson that he could take 8 Marines as well as some mercenaries and overthrow the government of Yusuf Karamanli in Tripoli. Excellent. Okay. I wasn't sure how far that story kind of traveled. We're rather fond of it in the United States, but I wasn't sure. Yes, in the United States, he is often considered a hero. Not always, but sometimes. And he backed with these 8 Marines, William Eaton, a man named Hamid Karamanli, the brother of Yusuf. So in writing this like modern captivity narrative in 1947, in recasting the Barbary captivity narratives, Kenneth Roberts, at the end of World War II and at the beginning of the Cold War, gets to pose and explore a variety of questions that are very important to Americans at that time. And I'm going to list these questions because I think that these are questions that endure for Americans throughout the 20th century. But they're really just beginning then. What is the purpose of American power? Is it reactionary, which means it permits the United States to assume its position with the great powers in Europe? Did America rise in power so that it could become like France, like Great Britain? Or is the purpose of American power revolutionary? Did we become a great power so that we could lift up others who were colonized like us by Great Britain, so that we could support the aspirations in what people during the Cold War called the so-called Third World? Should the United States revert to isolationist policies after the Second World War? Or should it assume a policy of internationalism? Should it become a global policeman? If it's the latter, what role should war play in an activist foreign policy? Or should peace at any price be worth pursuing? So these are some of the questions that Kenneth Roberts is going to be pursuing. This book is mostly out of print. I think it's come back now. You can purchase it on Kindle. It's one of those books that is forgotten. It has absolutely no significance anymore to Americans as a piece of literature. Kenneth Roberts is very famous. Some of his works are considered extraordinary pieces of art, but not Lydia Bailey. And yet I'm arguing that it is a critical Cold War text that needs to be remembered. And this is because, in part, of the timing and the popularity when it came out. This book came out in January 1947. 8 weeks later, on March 12, 1947, Truman issued his eponymous Truman Doctrine. Okay? The Truman Doctrine, at that time, a congressman said to Truman, you need to scare the hell out of the American people so that you can change American policy. And he told the country, and so the world, that he was going to provide economic and military assistance to all countries that were threatened by the Soviet Union, even what was then seemingly minor players like Greece and Turkey. And this broke with traditional American isolationism. At that time, Lydia Bailey, this book that I'm going to discuss today, had been #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for 5 weeks, and it would remain #1 for 6 weeks, another 6 weeks. And it was all about an activist foreign policy. So this very popular book, in some way, what I argue, was laying the groundwork culturally, in a literary fashion, for a very important, significant political change in American thinking. So it's encouraging readers to support an internationalist agenda in which the spreading of American values in developing countries, even by military might, because Albion Hamlin is going to say we need to make war on Tripoli and we need to effect regime change, is recognized as a legitimate means of protecting the United States' strategic interests. Now, this book, as I said, is part of a larger project. It's going to be one of what is literally hundreds of captivity narratives that I am going to be looking into for my next book. Islamic captivity narratives, as I'm calling them, so that I can get the broadest kind of view, because it kind of transcends, well, you know, it's one of those kind of word-playing games that you do when you're working on a book. The scary thing for people is the idea, or for Americans, is the idea of historically people from Muslim places taking an American, sometimes an American Christian, captive. And this has become sort of the formula that you see repeated over and over from the 17th century up until the present day, and that I'm going to be looking at. But I'm not going to be looking at it so as to say, oh, this is Orientalist garbage. It is Orientalist garbage. I'm not saying it's not. What I'm going to be looking at it for is to say what role, why are people writing about this? What role does it play in allowing for conversations to happen in the United States about their own issues? What vehicle does it serve, or is it kind of serving to allow for conversations about domestic policy? Policies, for example, concerning the role of women, the status of workers, or foreign policy. What role should the United States play in the world? These are the kinds of conversations that people who tell these tales typically have, because the Islamic world, via these captivity narratives, acts as a foil for the United States and allows for a conversation to happen. So you have sermons, plays, romance novels, speeches, media reports, films, and memoirs, repeating this theme over and over and over for 300 years, which is the captivity of Americans by Muslims, in particular in the Arab world. So I'm going to look at the longevity of this genre. I'm going to discount the fact that you can't tell anything accurate about the Arab Islamic world from them. And I'm going to compare these tales over time to illustrate how they have acted as a vehicle for ongoing debates among citizens of the United States over evolving conceptions of national identity and global power. Now, the basic structure of these narratives has not changed. There's always a capture, there's always some sort of suffering, and then there's always some sort of release. But the nuances and the conclusions have changed greatly over time. In 1703, for example, Cotton Mather gave a sermon. Cotton Mather was a Puritan minister. And he used such tales to warn against apostasy. That is, you don't want to, what he called, turn Turk. You don't want to become Muslim, even if you're thrown into captivity, even if you're taken captive and you're held hostage in North Africa. You must keep Puritan. It was actually a fashion for him to say, even in the hardest of conditions, you see these people being strong Christians. And here we are in the United States. We have this new influx of goods, new influx of wealth, and we are becoming lax and lazy in our beliefs. So that's kind of how that sermon was acting. It was saying people who are under the most severe conditions can keep their beliefs, but here we are in the United States where we have all of these wonderful things and people are becoming lazy in their value system. In 2004, so 300 years later, there's a romance author called Sandra Martin, and she depicted also a tale of captivity in which there's a fictional Arab country, a Muslim who takes an American woman captive, but she proposes cultural reconciliation. So she's saying it's time now to start thinking about how the United States can reconcile with this part of the world, this Arab world with which there is tension. And she's using a tale of captivity to say, you see, this is a possibility. So there's these sharp contextual distinctions and yet interesting continuities. And so I'm thinking that if I look at these different areas, and I've broken this book now into 10 different chapters, I could go into 15, and yet, you know, no one's going to publish this work, even at 10 chapters. It's too much. I could go into 20 chapters, but anyway, you have so much time when you're writing a book, and you have so many chapters. I've cut it into 10 chapters over 300 years. I think that we can look at some new insights into American politics and identity and how the Arab world has acted as a foil for American politics and identity. So these 10 chapters are the colonial times. There was a hostage crisis in 1797. This was after the United States became its own independent country. It was no longer protected by British treaties, and about 300 sailors were taken captive. There were the Barbary Wars. There was the antebellum period when speeches were using tales of slavery in the and Barbary slavery, white slavery in the North Africa to kind of make an argument to free slaves in America. There was the media coverage, because sometimes I don't deal, when I deal with both fact and fiction, but there was, of course, El Rasuli and the kidnapping of Ian Perdicaris. There was the silent film The Sheik with Rudolph Valentino. Has that film made it to this?
Perdicaris one?
No, Perdicaris I would assume made it, but The Sheik, Rudolph Valentino's movie The Sheik, has that made it to Morocco in terms of kind of a cultural kind of? In the 1920s, a silent film?
I don't think they're familiar.
Okay, so there's a very famous 1920s silent film with Rudolph Valentino, who is supposed to be this very handsome man who's still talked about as kind of this leading handsome man who kind of transformed the Arab captor from someone who was supposed to be very frightening to someone who's very attractive. And then there's the Cold War captivity narrative that I'm going to talk about today, and then media representations of the Iranian hostage crisis of 1979, And then the Iraq War, we have Jessica Lynch, and then present-day romance novels. So in each instance, I look at these Orientalist images and then try to go beyond these exoticized images in order to say, why does this continue in American culture? What purpose is it serving? What conversations is it allowing about American identity and America's role in the world, that this particular trope would continue through time? I think that in this instance, the instance of Lydia Bailey, it really allows for a cultural or literary foundation for the Cold War policies of Harry Truman, President Harry Truman. The author built on the familiarity in using and recasting a Barbary captivity narrative, the familiarity with North Africa that emerged after World War II. Americans were present in North Africa in numbers they had never been because of Operation Torch. They were following news in North Africa, so they were very familiar with it. There were new books on the history of the Barbary Wars because of the American presence here. And there were films like Casablanca. Has that film made it to? Okay, Casablanca has made it. All right, good. How about The Road to Morocco? That one's less the Bob Hope and Bing Crosby. Yeah. All right. The Wind and the Lion. Yes, that comes a little after this book, but that one is, at least they use Moroccan dialect in that one, right? Sometimes they get Iraqis to play Moroccans, but at least they got some real Moroccans somewhere. But anyway, okay. So Kenneth Roberts, the author, is recycling the Barbary captivity narrative so as to argue that the United States must play a greater role in world affairs. I went to Dartmouth College, and that's where Kenneth Roberts holds his papers, because we can do a textual analysis, but the best thing is to go and actually look at the papers and see how that supports what is written in the text. And I've only just begun. I have to admit that it was a quick trip, and what I did was I photocopied everything, and I have a big box at home that I'm slowly going through. And I know that the author compiled a bibliography that lists 21 captivity narratives dating to the late 18th and early 19th century. So he did a lot of research to kind of repeat exactly as much as he could a Barbary captivity narrative. And so there are some superficial similarities with the original Barbary captivity narratives. And yet he is recasting this story definitely within the fallout of World War II and Operation Torch. So let me move to the publication and reception of this book. It got a lot of press when it came out. There are at least 23 major book reviews and many, many more smaller book reviews in local papers about this book. The Yale Review called it the most widely publicized book of the new year. The William and Mary Quarterly noted that it rapidly scaled the heights of bestseller lists. Frederick R. Kirkland of the Pennsylvania Historical Society wrote, "No recent novel has been reviewed more favorably or more frequently." The New York Times noted that it sold almost within weeks more than 1 million copies. And Time Magazine noted that it sold the movie rights for what would today be for more than $1 million, which is not bad money. It was a Book of the Month club for two books, for two book clubs, the Book of the Month, a Book of the Month selection, the Book of the Month Club and the Literary Guild Club, which means that it sold very cheaply and reached a lot of households. The American Library Association deemed it one of 50 notable books of the year. And at the end of the year, it was the fourth most popular fiction book of the year. So again, today, it's out of print. But then it was an extremely important book, very lauded for its time. It was the result of 6 years of research. Much of that research was done during World War II. And so the impact of the war really can't be overstated. One literary scholar notes that, quote, with Lydia Bailey, Roberts departs from his usual message that war inevitably brings futility and hopelessness. Instead, he argues that at times men must fight to overthrow tyranny, to defend themselves, and to avoid greater suffering, end quote. And certainly the author seems to have internalized the lesson that there could be no conciliation of tyrants who subjected their own citizens to suffering. Thus, Lydia Bailey, and Lydia Bailey is a very strong woman, an unusually strong woman, tells her husband that, quote, such a country as Tripoli must be beaten and never again appeased, end quote. So you hear this, you know the term appeasement was very important before and during World War I, because that's what it was considered that England had done to Germany, was appease them, and that allowed for the war to begin, that allowed for Germany to expand. The echo of World War II can also be heard when Albion asserts that treating with Yusuf Karamanli would be, quote, to appease this man, to allow him to outgeneral us at the very moment we've got him whipped, would be horrible. The Times Literary Supplement, which is a British newspaper, insisted that, quote, Mr. Roberts's real object is to study the effects of appeasement in an earlier age, end quote. So clearly, people of the time are reading this within the shadow of World War II. But I think that when you read it closely, it becomes a book about spreading American values and protecting American interests. And that, in some sense, is something that the author thinks, if you believe that the author might be speaking through the main character, Albion Hamlin, perhaps literary scholars can explain to me how you can make that distinction. That's something we can talk about perhaps later. But the main character certainly seems to think that spreading American values is also a means of protecting the strategic interests of the United States. The author is going to merge fiction and fact in his book. In October 1803, Albion, the main character, is going to witness an actual fact, an event that took place, which is the USS Philadelphia is going to be taken by the forces of Tripoli, and 300 sailors are going to be taken captive. He then will watch the burning of the ship by a real-life hero, American hero Stephen Decatur, in February 1804. And at that point, his friend, a fictional character, is going to rescue him out of captivity. When he's free from the bonds of captivity, he's going to throw in his lot with William Eaton. His friend, King Dick, will take him to William Eaton, and he will throw in his lot with King Dick. His wife is still in captivity. And as we discussed, Jefferson purportedly has given his okay to take these 8 Marines, the mercenaries, and overthrow the government of Yusuf Karamanli, replace it with his brother Hammett. That way, there would be a government that would be supportive of American interests in power in North Africa. and you wouldn't have to pay tribute, and you wouldn't have to worry, are our men going to be taken captive when they're on the high seas? Roberts makes Eaton a very great hero over the course of the novel. And so one of Roberts' characters explains to Albion what he calls, quote, the meaning of the great scheme. So in discussing this overthrow, he says to him, and again, this is something that people are reading, they're thinking about, they're kind of soaking in this very important historical moment. It means, that is the overthrow, that there'd be an end to all this nonsense of great governments paying perpetual tribute to Tripoli and Tunis and Algiers so that their vessel won't be captured. It means that a good and kind man will rule the richest province of North Africa. It means, with the proper sort of advice, a good ruler of Tripoli could unite all of North Africa, Morocco, Algiers, Tunisia, and Tripoli. Here would be the United States of North Africa, ruled by a man who would owe everything to an American. Any treaty that the United States of America wished to make with the United States of North Africa would be entered into without question. Do you see the possibilities in all this? End quote. So here you see the author endorsing regime change at the hands of an American government as a means of fostering a better world, one more friendly to American political and commercial interests. Despite this military victory, that is, of taking Derna, Albion and Eaton, after taking Derna on April 27th, 1805, perceive that there's a problem, that they're not getting the support to move on to Tripoli. So they're going to meet with Commodore Barron in Malta, but he, it turns out, is sick, and so they need to meet with his kind of lackey, as he's described by the author, who is Tobias Lear. And Lear is the foil for Albion. The reader is clearly not supposed to like Lear. Tobias Lear is a real person. He had never been demonized before this book, and you can bet that in the archives of the Kenneth Roberts papers, his descendants are livid with this representation of their great-great-grandfather. Anyway, they find that Lear, or at least Albion does, is small-minded and short-sighted, and he wants to avoid war at any cost. So he is very hesitant, if not outrightly recalcitrant, to effect regime change. And this kind of recalcitrance convinces the reader to throw in his lot with Albion and Eaton, because he's really not a pleasant person, and he's clearly short-sighted. He wants to free the hostages, but he'll continue paying tribute to do so. He only wants to free the hostages because he thinks it'll bring glory to himself. He says to Albion, there's one point you seem to be overlooking. There are 300 American sailors in Tripoli. Just what do you imagine would happen to those 300 Americans if they were in Tripoli when the city was attacked? You persist, he continues, gentlemen, in thinking that in this situation the prime object of our country is to make war, thus endangering the lives of 300 American sailors in Tripoli, rather than to make peace and deliver these prisoners from slavery, end quote. So it's really just, now it sounds, I mean, it's not that Albion wants these prisoners to have any harm come to them, but he is convinced the hostages would want Karamanli to, one, pay for any vile deeds, and two, understand that the needs of the nation come before the needs of the individual. And so he is presenting Lear as someone who has a very narrowly conceived set of strategic interests, that he's not seeing a larger picture. of what is best for the United States. Robert paints Albion as a character who thinks broadly, allowing policy planning to encompass long-term goals that speak to the national values of the United States. He is going to say, quote, "If Joseph Caramanli is allowed to blackmail America now, when one more push would topple him into the dirt where he belongs, he'll go on blackmailing America until he is kicked into the dirt. We've got him where he has no choice but to surrender unconditionally, if General Eaton is allowed to keep on. Any peace that's made should be on our own terms. Not one penny should be paid out in ransom. Why pay ransom to a murderer when the same amount of money given to Eaton would forever put an end to ransom paying? The national honor of the United States is vastly more important than shortening the term of imprisonment of 300 American sailors, and any American ought to understand by now that his country should be above haggling with a pirate." So in this passage, you see that Roberts is advocating an internationalist agenda to his readership, which consists of war-weary Americans, because they're thinking, again, of disbanding the American army, who nevertheless are being asked by Harry Truman to maintain a militarized nation. So in conclusion, the fate of this very first effort at, and I know this is a heavily charged word, but regime change is still a subject of debate in the United States. Eaton and the first these eight Marines who accompanied him are to this day glorified in the Marine hymn, Battle Hymn of the Republic. Have you guys ever heard of that? Do you know it? Do I need to sing it? From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Okay. Yes, good. Cultural literacy just went up a little bit. Okay. For their taking of okay, so the U.S. government ultimately negotiated a treaty with Yusuf. Okay, so they used the pressure of taking Derna to pressure Yusuf Karamanli to treat with them and release those 300 captives. And he did so because that was a pretty good bargaining chip. But the denouement of the Tripolitan War did not prevent tribute taking on the Mediterranean Sea, which is something that Hammett had in fact promised if he was going to be put in power. And so within another 10 years, there's going to be another war. And so, as interpreted by Albion, the United States protected Americans, but it did so at the expense of its long-term interests. So American readers in 1947 are seeing this story, seeing this maybe as a cautionary tale. One of their, seeing that maybe the U.S. needs to play a more active role in the far reaches of the non-Western world. So even though there are no Russians in Lydia Bailey, there are no spies who come in from the cold, I would still argue that this is a very critical Cold War text. I would argue that particularly since within the next 7 years, there are going to be two very effective efforts at regime change that the United States does engage in. That Iran, 1953, Guatemala, 1954, then there's going to be an effort in Cuba that Eisenhower puts together and John Kennedy tries to actually effect, that this is kind of, seen as maybe something that can be an effective way of acting as a country. So Lydia Bailey is offering a new post-war means of imagining the world and America's role in it. Kenneth Roberts argued that American might, which was based on a set of superior ideas, must be mustered in order to improve the world, even when such change must happen with the assistance of Marines. This was an important message for Americans to hear at that time, and so this highly publicized and widely touted bestseller helped ready Americans for President Truman's activist foreign policy message of March 1947. Thank you.
Ready for some questions?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, we have quite enough time, I guess, for questions and answers. And I can just say a couple of things. We have a course, I didn't say this to my friend Stacy, but we have a course on Moroccan-US relations, and one part of the course is about Barbary period. And usually students are fascinated by these twists in the early American history, and particularly the Tripolitan affair. And I guess many of them have read some of the books, history books that deal with this period. And I'm sure there are some questions or maybe certain things that they want to
within
explore.
the Dutch period, from the inception of the United States up to the 1890s, they say that the United States was aloof. That's what is argued for. But when you look into the Barbary encounter, you find that the United States sought to set an example, not by staying aloof, but actually intervening in world affairs. And the Barbary is a case in point where the United States fought Tripoli and fought Algiers in a show of an early case of US interventionism in the Maghreb or in the MENA region in general. So I think that there is an argument to advance regarding this trend, which questions the isolationist strand of American exceptionalism during that period up to the 1890s. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, but I think it's, in terms of intervention, I think that's a really strong word. Like, I think that Roberts is recasting this so that, just as I'm warning that I'm using the term regime change, and that's such a product of our times, that I have to really be careful.
It's a bit presentist.
Isn't it? It is. So I have to be careful. Like, that was just something that I noticed that I had done as I was reading through. I'm like, did he use that term, or is that me using that term because that's what I am familiar with? I think intervention in the same way would be too strong of a word for that particular time. We have two marginal powers in the Barbary Wars looking to kind of show themselves, not to each other. They could really care less about each other. The United States could care less about the so-called, if you excuse, Tripoli and Algiers and Morocco. They could care less about those powers. But in showing that they are strong vis-a-vis Morocco and Tripoli and Algiers, then maybe England and France will leave them alone, right? This is a war so that England and France will say, oh, we should take note and leave the United States alone. So it's an intervention that is done for reasons other than, and that's often the case, isn't it, in countries of the Middle East and Africa, that you make an intervention based on what's going on in Europe. And in that sense, I think you're onto something really interesting. I think that there are certain precedents set in not intervention per se, but going to war to fight, going to war without a formal declaration of war.
Yeah, that was a breach of the American Constitution because Jefferson didn't consult.
That's right. Going to war without a formal declaration of war, absolutely. Going to war without having American territory physically threatened, that's a precedent that was set. We will go to war without having our territory physically threatened. So there are a certain set of precedents that were set that I think that you're absolutely right. That set of Barbary Wars, so-called Barbary Wars, did set some important precedents. But in terms of intervention in the Arab world, that I'm not sure I would say is one of them.
So my name is Etman Warab. I'm a first-year doctorand at the Faculty of Humanities BNMSIC. And I'm currently working on prison literature, mainly in Morocco. But I'm not interested in historical prison literature mainly. I'm interested in present-day narratives, of which we have quite a number of accounts. So I said I'm going to pick up at the intervention that you are speaking of, and I'm going to link the Tripolitan War to the 2011 US intervention in Libya. Comparing the two incidents, I mean there is no, I know that there is no room for comparison due to the big gap in history, but just from the viewpoint of power, at that time, in 1801 up until 1805, the US was at its very beginning. It was still in the very beginning, in the Persian period. And it has to make, it had to make itself powerful in the eyes of the imperial European states. And I would like to see this late intervention in Libya as an act of maintaining that power. And if we link it again to terrorism and the abstaining of using power, for example, in Syria, I do say that all these conversations about captivity narratives are brought up by present-day conditions. You have mentioned, in the case of Kenneth Roberts, the Cold War and the World War and the Second World War. And I would like to see the ongoing discussion on these captivity narratives in the context of the war on terror, mainly after 9/11. And you have mentioned one point which I very much agree upon, is the ongoing conversation on these narratives, or bringing them up all the time, is pinned down to one question or one issue, which is American identity or the purpose of using American power. And part of the answer for this question is what is it that makes the identity of America? And part of the answer, I think, is to keep asking the same question. Thank you.
To keep asking,
Yeah,
to keep asking what
the question, what is the identity of the
that is part of the identity.
part of it.
That's fascinating. That's a fascinating idea, actually. That is that not really being sure.
Yeah, it's always in the
Yes.
It's always, it's not,
That
it's not
being in
really
flux
one
and not
identity.
being sure. That's a really interesting idea, so I thank you for
Well, thank you for your lecture. Very informative. Complement what we have covered with Dr. Aziz. Among the question that your book revealed, why do Americans still adopt this kind of oriental discourse? I have a short question here. Have you come across some writing from Arab Muslim words that criticize this type of oriental discourse? Some kind of counter-narrative, for example.
I have not looked for it, and I teach a course on American representations in the Middle East and North Africa. And I have decided to focus on American representations. I know that writing, that's a whole other kind of work, and we critique the work. Like, that's a whole other kind of genre. I have looked into finding, like, stuff for my students in translation. I haven't had luck with that. So I kind of just leave it at American representations that I kind of criticize and break down myself.